Bloomberg had a piece out this morning and criticizing you, Paul, and you, Tucker, and me as well, that we've all been way too accepting of inflation, that we don't know what to do with it, and we're all just sitting back and dealing with these price increases that we're all dealing with and not putting up much of a fight. And this didn't occur to me because I wasn't around in the 1960s, but a number of people, one of them chief economist at UBS Global Wealth Management, Paul Donovan, pointed out, like, hey, in the 60s when we were dealing with this same crap, people were out in the streets boycotting grocery stores, and there was like a woman-led grocery store boycott back in the 60s of people picketing outside of stores saying, this is ridiculous, you're charging too much, bring prices back down. And it is interesting because we have been tremendously accepting of higher prices over the last 2 years, in my opinion. I don't, maybe I'm missing the boat. Maybe there are boycotts going out out there, but I drive by car dealerships. I don't see people picketing saying, these prices are way too high. And I do wonder that in an age where it is, we complain about everything.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Social media, like, you complain about your neighbor's fence color. We complain about traffic being too bad, and really just incredibly accepting of price increases, which, I've seen signs of it here and there where people are finally saying, no, this is too much. Walt Disney is a good example of that.
Yep.
But generally speaking, I don't know, maybe you have a different perspective, Paul, but it does seem like maybe just because of all the money that was stuffed into our pockets over the last year, or maybe just because we haven't had any meaningful inflation in a few decades now, that people just didn't really know what to do about it.
I would agree with your overall sentiment. It seems like the more people you talk with, it's just a reality that everyone sort of hums and haws about, oh, geez, it's a pain in the neck to deal with, but we're getting by and we're doing the best that we can. The issue that's brought to light in this piece is it's one thing to have inflation. It's one thing everyone understands that if the cost of goods increase, that you have to increase your price. However, it becomes problematic when you manipulate or take advantage of the fact that costs of goods have been increasing to overinflate your prices to a point where you're increasing your margins beyond where they normally are unnecessarily just because you're taking advantage of the consumer psyche. And in particular, the one example that stood out to me of perhaps using this to their advantage is Cal-Maine Foods, which is the biggest egg producer in the country. We all know the bird flu and the cost of egg prices is something that has been attributed to grocery store inflation. They reported a 700% increase in profits, and particularly what was alarming was their margin expansion. Obviously, eggs operate at a very low margin of about 8%. Historically, Cal-Maine Foods came out and said they had increased their margins to 41%. Great for stockholders, not great for egg buyers. And that's an example where perhaps there does need to be, I wouldn't say
riots on the street is what Paul is calling for.
I wouldn't say complaining like this article is suggesting. We live in a free-flowing market where there's that balance of supply and demand. Pivot and buy other products.
You know what? I had just figured out how I'm going to protest this. I'm going to make my 4-year-old carry the eggs to the grocery store every time we buy a pack of eggs. They never, if your 4-year-old drops a pack of eggs, they do not make you pay for them. So that's going to be my policy going forward is every time I go to the grocery store, my 4-year-old is going to be responsible for the eggs. And if a few happen to get broken here and there, a few cases of eggs happen to get broken, I'm only going to buy the 48 packs from now on, by the way, too.
My son would.
That'll be my protest.
My son at a little over a year and a half would more than welcome the opportunity to crush as many eggs as possible because it's entertainment.
So I do wonder if there is some demographic point to this as well. I mean, it is certainly true that the prime age employment to population ratio right now is quite high. We covered this the other day that we're pushing all-time highs in the key working demographic, 25 to 54 age working ratio. And so throughout many countries, you can look at this across many countries, but people are less willing to protest. They are less willing to cause social unrest when they are working. Right? I mean, just for a number of practical reasons. You're working, you have a job, you have income, you don't have time, you're tired all the time, or at least I am. And so when we have an incredibly tight labor market, I think that also may be playing a role here. I'm not sure it is entirely just like society-based is different now than it was in the 1960s. You think of the 1960s, most women weren't working in the workforce, and so it was just a different type of situation. It was a tight labor market back then, but you did not have the same employment to population ratios that you have these days. But again, yeah, my social media feed is not stuffed with people, saying, "Hey, this is ridiculous that I am being charged $40,000 for a used vehicle, or that I'm paying $4 for a 12-pack of eggs."
This also needs to take into consideration the 60s were a persistent period of inflation where we'd have to go side-by-side comparison, but I'm making an educated guess that it was more substantial inflation than what we're battling with today. The other piece of it is we are coming off what was a very robust period. Obviously, the pandemic was awful for many reasons, but it did pad savings, so there was a little bit more cushion heading into this inflationary time period where people were more willing to deplete some of their savings for Walt Disney trips, for vehicles, for some of these items here. Ultimately, our free market should sort this out. It should get to a point where if inflation becomes unbearable, people will switch and buy other products or not buy certain products. You'd hope that dynamic would sort of show itself. I think it ultimately will. Complaining, to me, I guess it's an option, but ultimately I'd rather have the buy and sell dynamics really sort this out.
I will point out, so there's this theory of profit-led inflation, and the idea there is that, the inflation isn't necessarily being created by money printing or stimulus payments, but rather corporations who are choosing to raise prices more than they need to. And I'm sorry, but I don't really buy that. I mean, corporations are always going to try and eke out as much profit as possible, and that is not what's causing the inflation. They're always trying to raise prices. It's just that right now happens to be a time where they're more willing to, or more able to do so, because everybody's flush with cash.
Right. And that's why you don't have monopolies. That's why we have a competitive market where if Mercedes wants to jack up their prices 43% since 2019,
which they have,
great. There's a bunch of other cars that you can go buy instead. And the same thing should apply for eggs. Get some chickens in your backyard or go to a local farm stand or whatever the case may be. Walt Disney, go to Six Flags. There's alternatives out there. And that's what should ultimately play out is that companies should be held accountable because there are other options out there.
And I think there are areas where this is happening, albeit I don't see protests over it. But, I mean, beer producers overdid the price increases, it seems, because they saw demand drop last year. Walt Disney, Bob Iger has been pretty public about the fact that, hey, we might have been a little bit aggressive about these price hikes. I think they had good reason to do so, right? They were closed for how long? 9 months?
Right.
They couldn't have any visitors, so I get why they were trying to make up for that lost time. But
Airlines,
even they are
another good example of that, too.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to look at an airline and say, shouldn't they be charging this? They lost all their business customers and they didn't have any customers for a good year. I guess the counterpoint to that would be, well, then we shouldn't have bailed them out. So, it cuts both ways. Disney, Disney didn't get a bailout. All the airlines, on several different occasions, have gotten buyouts with very few strings attached. So I'm a little bit more critical of price increases in that area.